So a very warm welcome to Buddhistisches tour, especially if it's your first time here. Hope you had a good meditation next door. Great. So I thought we'd begin today with a question. Does anybody notice anything different in this room than in any other room? Just to get our senses working a bit. Oh, well done. I was going to say it's the elephant in the room, but it's the Buddha in the room. Yeah. So, yeah, there's a giant golden Buddha here, isn't there? And what would you say that represents?
Liberation.
Liberation. Very good. Enlightenment, yeah? So, in a way, enlightenment, the rest of Buddhism obviously, well, it might not be obvious, but the rest of Buddhism comes out of this thing, enlightenment, yeah? The whole of what we call Buddhism, it's the kind of, enlightenment is the central pivot, yeah? And everything comes from this, I don't know if you could call it an experience or not, but comes from enlightenment, yeah? So I thought we'd have a look at enlightenment today. Obviously, enlightenment is a translation, yeah? It's interesting, or at least I found it interesting, that in translation, at least in English, we have one word, enlightenment, yeah? In the Buddhist tradition, there's a number of different words that kind of mean the same thing and point to different aspects of enlightenment. So, in a way, it points to the fact that we're kind of at the beginning of something here as well, as a Buddhism in the, well, you could say Western world, modern world, yeah? We have one word, whereas actually there's quite a number of words. So, well, there's nirvana. I'm sure everyone's heard of that, whether it's the band or the actual Buddhist nirvana, yeah, nirvana, it's an interesting word. It literally means something like blowing out, yeah, extinguishing. Extinguishing of maybe the three fires, yeah, of greed, hatred and delusion. So enlightenment is the blowing out of greed, hatred and delusion, yeah. There's another word, bodhi, which means awakening, yeah. It's quite interesting. I was listening to something recently, and I think it was when there was a lot of British archaeologists in India during the colonization, the Raj, and they kept discovering this figure called Bowd, this guy called Bowd, yeah, in all these different sites, and they had no idea at that point, because it more or less disappeared out of India itself. They had no idea that this was the same figure, Buddha, that was existent in Sri Lanka, Japan, China. So I just thought it was quite interesting. About Bodhi means awakening, essentially, yeah? Waking up. And there's also a lovely word called vimutti, or vimukti, which means liberation, yeah, or release, something like this, yeah? So you've got these different words, don't you? You've got kind of extinguishing of greed, hatred, and delusion, yeah? You've got awakening, yeah? Some kind of like waking up out of a dream, yeah? And you've got release, liberation, yeah? So everything comes from this point, yeah, and it's the kind of, well, it's the goal of Buddhist life, you could say, yeah. So today I thought we'd look at three things, yeah. Firstly, what can be said about enlightenment, what can't be said about enlightenment, and what the Buddha tried to communicate about enlightenment itself that is actually helpful to us in our lives and that can change our lives, yeah. Actually, I think I'll swap the first two around. So we'll begin with what can't be said about enlightenment, yeah? So what can't be said about enlightenment. In a way, nothing can be said about enlightenment. Yeah. There we go. The Buddha said enlightenment was a tuck of archery, yeah? Beyond words, yeah? Yeah, there you go. And he also said that it was beyond mere reasoning, yeah, and rationale. So he's not saying, it's not that it's anti-reason, yeah, but it's beyond reason, yeah. The rational mind can't grasp enlightenment, yeah. Reason and the rational mind are useful in many ways, but they're also, in a way, just a function of something much vaster and more mysterious, yeah. And maybe because we've had sort of enormous success in recent decades and centuries with our kind of scientific and technological, rational outlook. We've kind of elevated the rational mind to a kind of godlike status, which is interesting. It's become our sort of religion. You know, we've got these scientists, our priests, and da-da-da-da-da. But in a way, the rational mind is a function of consciousness, yeah? It's not consciousness itself, yeah? And enlightenment is basically about the total transformation of consciousness, yeah? Not just the rational mind. It's not just about understanding a new idea or cognitively understanding an idea. It's a complete transformation of consciousness, yeah? Yeah, I mean, it's not that the Buddha's saying, well, the Buddha's definitely not saying that enlightenment is like some kind of nice, vague, warm, fluffy, drug-like state where everything's just nice. It's not that. It's more just, it's a direct knowledge and, transformation. Maybe it makes more sense to give a couple of examples from my own life. Not saying that I'm enlightened. That would be amazing. But no, it's a kind of a glimpse of a glimpse of a glimpse, probably, of a glimpse. But it illustrates the point, yeah? So the first thing I was thinking was, the first thought that came to mind was when I was ordained, yeah? It was on a 4-month retreat in the mountains of Spain after about 10 years of engagement and fairly intensive. It doesn't take 10 years for everyone, by the way, but it took me quite a long time. Engagement and transformation, yeah? And training, yeah? And when I was ordained, I won't go into what that means, but there's a whole ritual, you know. I came out of my ordination completely confused, yeah? I felt like I'd stepped into something, like a stream of something that I had no idea about, yeah? And something just kind of expanded. My whole world was kind of rocked. And saying all this is completely meaningless, yeah? It's just kind of, it goes in, you hear it, you know, that's interesting, he's on a retreat and something, did some little ritual and had a different time. And so the words, I mean, not that, maybe it highlights that I'm not a master communicator, but words only go so far, yeah? It's like that experience completely changed my life and still has repercussions now. It's completely changed the direction of my life, yeah? So in a way, what I've just said is pointless, yeah? In a way. So that's what I mean. Yeah, but it was probably one of the most significant, meaningful and opening moments in my life, which I have no way of... It's like when people tell you their dreams, sometimes they'll have a huge dream, and you can tell it's been really important for them, and they tell you, and you're like, oh yeah, and then the dog turned into a cloud, and then, and then it moved here, and that means now you feel happy, and you just can't communicate on that level, yeah? The second one was, I just finished an intensive 10-day meditation retreat with some other people here, led by actually the man that ordained me, called Satyaraja, and gave me this name, yeah? Tarapalita. And I was very lucky. It was kind of the best meditation retreat I think I've ever done, which was completely surprised for me that would happen. And I was regularly in what you call, I don't know, us at our best, yeah, a kind of higher state. Sometimes it's pleasurable, sometimes not. But the point is, it wasn't just hedonic pleasure, and I felt like something happened. There was like at times a kind of direct perception of something that I wouldn't even begin to be able to. I can't even explain it to myself. But again, it's nudged me on a new course in my life, yeah. So I say all this in a way because, what you can't say about enlightenment, yeah? All that is a very, very distant glimpse of this thing, yeah? To remind us that at the heart of Buddhism is actually a mystery, as much as we like to secularize everything these days. Unfortunately, for secular kind of militants, at the heart of Buddhism is actually a mystery. It's something that when you taste it, it's kind of ungraspable, yeah? It's vital, alive, and you can't really understand it with a thin layer of consciousness that we call reason or rationale, yeah? It's actually really important, yeah? But that's not the end of the story. Otherwise, none of us would be here. There'd be no Buddhism. So the Buddha did speak and communicate about enlightenment, yeah? And actually the Buddha he uses language masterfully, yeah? He's a real master craftsman, like an incredible communicator, yeah? Extraordinary communicator. And he really used language as a tool, yeah? To help other people that he came into contact move towards, well, liberation, yeah, freedom. Yeah, sometimes he spoke, well, I'd imagine if that would have been you as a direct communication, he'd be speaking to your head and your heart, or I don't know what he'd be speaking to. But he spoke to the head and the heart, yeah? Sometimes he spoke in terms of images and metaphors and poetry, yeah? To open things up. And sometimes he also used, well, concrete formulas, yeah, methods. So he spoke to both, yeah. So I thought we'd have a look at a couple of images and metaphors, yeah, to do with enlightenment. Again, you can't. It's not the thing in itself, but it points towards something. So, very concrete example. He said, attaining enlightenment is like you've been, or like you are heavily in debt. Yeah, you owe a lot of people a lot of money, and they're all coming for you. Yeah, and all of a sudden your debts are gone. They're cleared. Yeah, it's a relief. Has anyone, maybe I shouldn't ask this, has anyone, no, I won't ask if anyone's been in debt or if anyone is in debt. Maybe there's a lot of hands go up. It's a bit of a miserable subject. But I was thinking, when I was about 20 years old, I went to the bank and got a £5,000 loan out to buy a studio, yeah, to buy a music studio. And the guy, the bank manager or whoever it was, the first guy working there said, you know, in 3 years, you'll have to start paying this back and it will come with interest. And I was like, I'm going to be a world famous producer by then. Like, in 3 years, I'll be able to just pay it off in one go. Like, it's not recognizing the greatness. And it didn't quite go according to plan. So, you know, I had that debt and then I had another debt. And it started piling up. I was very lucky. Like, a relative of mine died and left me a bit of money, but it was enough to clear my debts. And I remember going into the bank with one feeling, cleared all my debts outright, came out, and I was like, I felt so light. Yeah, it was like a burden had just come off my back. Yeah. So that's one way the Buddha talked about enlightenment. It's like we've got this debt, you might say, karmic debt. Yeah. He also talked about it as a burden. Yeah. It's like you've been carrying this huge, heavy bag on your back, you know, and you've been struggling along with this bag, and you just take the bag off and you drop it, and you're like, it's a relief, yeah? You drop the burden, yeah? You drop the burden perhaps of hatred, yeah? Greed, delusion. And I don't know about you, but for me, when I'm in a state of conflict or hatred with someone, it feels like a burden. Yeah? It feels like a pressure, like a weight. So dropping that, it's gone, yeah? So he talked about it's like getting out of prison as well. I won't ask if anyone's been in prison either. I mean, maybe a few have. I've had quite a lot of friends and family that's been to prison, some for short stretches and some for longer stretches. I had a couple of friends who actually said it was the best thing that happened to them, yeah. These are like shorter stretches, like 1 to 2 years, yeah, because they actually stopped in their life and had a look at their life and came out differently, like, all right, I need to change something. But the general feeling is, I can't wait to get out of this place. This is awful, yeah, kind of compression, contraction. Yeah, I don't know what it's like in Germany, but in the UK, I had friends of mine that were on what you call a 23-hour lockup. So you're basically in a cell for 23 hours a day. Maybe because the UK didn't have the funds, I don't know, they're in jail for 23 hours a day and then they get an hour out. So you can imagine being released from that. That's pretty amazing, yeah? So he said enlightenment's like this, yeah? So there's just some images. I kind of like those images because they're simple and you can kind of relate to them, yeah? But you also talked in terms of formula, yeah, like logic, practical steps to move us forward. And the kind of, you could say the kind of, the logical formula of enlightenment, which you've probably heard a lot about over the recent weeks, especially with Lalitharatna, yeah, is this you know, Lalitharatna's got this little hand thing, yeah? Do you know what TikTok is, Lalitharatna?
I'm aware of it.
Yeah?
I can't go in it.
Yeah, it's like apparently some like Chinese spyware. So I don't know what it is, but it's basically you've got these little dancers. Yeah, people do a little stupid dance and become millionaires. Yeah, they like, yeah. Anyway, so the formula is this being, that becomes. On the arising of this, that arises. This not being, that does not become. On the ceasing of this, that ceases. Don't cut that out and edit it and put me on the internet, please, Bob. Yeah. So, yeah, it's basically saying everything arises on conditions, yeah? Nothing exists as an independent entity. Everything in this world, yeah? You could take anything, your favorite style of music, yeah? Blade of grass, political systems, this chair, I don't know, I don't want to get clever. The universe, gravity, star systems, it applies to everything, yeah? The Buddha said it was true in all places and at all times, yeah? That everything arises on conditions, yeah? Everything arises from causes, and when the conditions are no longer there, the thing itself ceases, yeah? So if the conditions aren't there to support a certain arising, it won't happen, and if they are, it will, and if they're not there, so on and so forth, yeah? Worth saying at this point, it's a bit like the previous point, for the Buddha, that wasn't an idea, that was a direct perception, yeah? Which is not like us, yeah? We see things, me, you, camera, room, yeah? We can't help but see things as things. They're kind of discrete objects, yeah? And we respond in the same way according to that, yeah? But for the Buddha, it wasn't really like that. And that experience freed the Buddha, yeah? Completely freed him from all his suffering, which is interesting, yeah? Jesus. Yeah, so that experience freed the Buddha, and then he did something fantastic. He applied it directly to our experience, yeah? So the Buddha began his quest. He left home. It said he left home in search of the end of suffering, yeah? And he claimed to have found the end of suffering, yeah? He'd suffered no more suffering, and not just no suffering, but a state of liberation, yeah? And that's what Buddhism is. It's his communication with people, trying to share, trying to help people out of the mess they're in, yeah, the suffering. But what he did was, well, we can all be very grateful. He basically, this whole business of everything arising in conditions, he found out what the conditions were for our suffering, yeah? So why we suffer, the Buddha found that out, yeah? And he also found out how we can be happy, yeah? So there's conditions. None of us want to suffer, but if we wanted to suffer, there's a load of conditions we can do to make sure we definitely suffer. Yeah, I'm sure we've all pretty good at that. I'm good at that. And there's a load of other conditions we can do, a lot of other things we can do where we can actually, will give rise to happiness. Yeah? Yeah, because I guess, I would imagine happiness is the thing we want most in life, one way or another, whether we do it in a twisted way by torturing ourselves. We're trying to be happy, yeah, in some way. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, in a way, this was what was happening on the retreat. We kind of got to the point of seeing, it may be obvious, but you will never find happiness by looking for it. If you're looking for happiness as a thing that you will have in your life, it will not happen. Yeah. Happiness, just to say, I mean, that's partially, I was thinking it's probably one of the reasons why there's so much unhappiness in our culture, because we've got this kind of, I mean, I've got a lot of friends that work in advertising, and there's a kind of idea that there's this like push button idea that you can just get happiness somehow. If you get this one thing, or these few things, or even this sort of life, it will make you happy, yeah? If you just get all this stuff. Buddhism saying, or the Buddha saying, no, yeah? That's not how happiness actually arises, yeah? Happiness is a byproduct, yeah? That's all it is. It's a byproduct of something else, yeah? It's not a thing that you can go to directly, yeah? So, that's interesting. So, what is it a byproduct of? Yeah, the Buddha said happiness is basically a byproduct of what's called skillful actions. Sounds a bit technical, but that's what he said. It's a byproduct of skillful actions. Does anybody know what is meant by skillful actions? There's enough people here that's regular enough to know what a skillful action is. No?
Right speech.
Right speech. What speech?
Helpful speech.
Speech. Kind speech.
Generosity.
Generosity. Any more?
Well, want to take it all.
Don't want to take it from everyone.
Is any action that's not influenced by greed, hatred, delusion?
Yeah,
So that comes out of metta.
yeah. So actions that come out of basically not being selfish. Yeah. So it's ironic, isn't it? It's a bit unfair, really, because we are selfish because we want nice things to happen to us and we want a happy life. So we want to grab things to make us happy, and it has a complete opposite effect, according to the Buddha. Yeah. Bit unfortunate, but basically, skillful action is an action that is comes based out of intelligence, wisdom, and empathy. Yeah. So if you're with somebody and you actually care about them and you do things for people, whether you know them or not, whether you like them or not, interestingly in Buddhism, the Buddha doesn't distinguish whether you like someone or not. If you act with kindness and some sort of awareness and you're genuinely trying to leave your ego behind, to say it like that, yeah, and you do that consistently, yeah, you will be happy. That's what the Buddha is saying. Yeah, it's hard work. Speaking from experience, it's hard work. But also, it does work. Maybe other people have found other things that lead to permanent and lasting happiness, but the Buddha's saying that if you want to be miserable, it's quite easy. Yeah, you just be selfish and aggressive and greedy and yeah, all this stuff. We suffer that way. Yeah, the fruit of those kind of actions is suffering for ourselves and other people. The fruit of behaving skillfully with other people, yeah, is happiness, yeah, for ourselves and other people. And this does require a bit of a leap of faith because it's not immediate. And that's part of the reason why it's so difficult for us, because it's not like, right, I'm going to be nice to people like properly all day today, and at the end of the day, I want to feel good. And okay, that didn't happen. I'm going to try it this week. The week's gone by. I'm still not feeling happy. Buddhism's garbage. Yeah, I don't bother with Buddhism. It doesn't work. It takes a long time, which is why you need people that have been doing it for a long time around you, because they're like, don't worry. Yeah, it takes years. It's like there's an analogy of like steering a huge ocean liner. You don't just turn the thing around. It takes a long time, but it does work. Yeah. So yeah, skillful actions are actions that come from the desire to kind of share, love people, yeah, and that it gets expressed in words and deeds, yeah. It's a kind of outward-looking thing, yeah. Yeah. So, basically, to wrap it up, we kind of had a look at what you can't say about Buddhism, about Enlightenment, sorry, yeah, that at the heart of Buddhism, there is kind of a mystery that when you actually, well, for example, when you do change your conditions, yeah, everything's conditional, but if you change your conditions, and for example, you do go on a retreat where you're meditating a lot every day and everyone else is trying to do that around you, and you don't have loads of input, and you have some kind of goodwill in that situation, very strange things start happening. I mean, strange, but only strange because they're unfamiliar. It's like we have a bandwidth, and it starts to open, yeah? And you think, wow, there is a much, much bigger world out here, and now why am I living on this little hamster wheel? Yeah, this little kind of narrow life. Just that's what I felt on this retreat. I just thought, what am I doing? What am I actually doing? Yeah, it's mad. My general day-to-day life, I just thought, something's kind of, it's a bit crazy, you know? Anyway, I won't get personal. Yeah, we also saw that the Buddha did use words to communicate, to help people towards a state of enlightenment. Yeah, he used images, stories, metaphors, and he also used formulas. Yeah, but especially this formula of this being that becomes what's called conditioned co-production. Yeah, it's like a formula that you can apply to everything. Yeah, nothing is a thing in and of itself, and in a way, with Buddhism, we're trying to take that as an idea. Yeah, that everything is dependent on thousands or millions of other conditions and turn that into a lived experience. And that's essentially what Buddha is in a sense, I guess, yeah. It's a direct knowledge of that, yeah, which is liberating, yeah. And then we saw that, the Buddha applied that to our situation, to our suffering, yeah. Obviously, it's out of compassion. He saw that we're suffering and we don't need to suffer. And that's why he communicated, basically. That's why we have Buddhism, yeah? there are conditions that we can put into place so that we don't suffer, and there are conditions we can put into place so that we can actually be truly happy. Yeah, and those conditions are basically acting what you might call ethically, although it's a bit of a narrow word in this case. Acting skillfully, acting well. Yeah. Another way it's talked about is purification. A bit of an unpopular word, but we're kind of purifying ourselves. Yeah, we're purifying ourselves according to Buddhism from greed, hatred, and delusion. Yeah, which is very hard work, but it seems that is the only, what do they say, the only game in town or something in town. Yeah. So happiness is a byproduct of that. Yeah. Yeah. I think just to keep it super simple, I thought there's 3 things that one could remember. Yeah. First thing, which comes from this retreat, the first thing is actions have consequences. Yeah. I mean, we all know that, don't we? But we kind of don't. Yeah. So actions have consequences. Yeah. The second thing is unskillful actions do actually lead to suffering. Yeah, for ourselves and other people. Yeah. And the third thing is skillful actions lead to happiness. Yeah. And are part of the way to what you might say is final liberation or enlightenment. Yeah. Yeah, I thought I'd finish maybe with the first 2 verses of the Dhammapada, which hopefully I can remember. But the Dhammapada, by the way, is probably about as close as we'll get to the Buddha's actual words. In a way, it's one of the most well-known of the early texts in Buddhism, and well worth reading actually. Very direct. No, in a way, it's funny because this whole. Maybe we have questions afterwards, but sometimes people get a bit. There can be all sorts of like feelings of guilt about acting unskillfully and then suffering and. But I can't. The Buddha doesn't care. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha's not here to kind of sort out our guilt problems or how we might react to it. He's just kind of found this formula, and he's like, boom, this is what it is. Deal with it. Which is it takes a bit of unpacking for us, yeah. But it's all out of compassion, yeah. So, experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows. As the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox drawing the cart. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows like a shadow that never departs. There we go. Maybe we'll have a bit of time for questions if anybody has any thoughts about. Yes. Yeah, so it said that there's a certain point where you can't fall back. You will never get yourself into the kind of horrendous states that you used to get yourself into. Yeah. In Buddhism, there's a fantastic term, like you just said, called stream entry. Yeah, which apparently is kind of. Well, Sangharakshita said for any order member. In this lifetime, stream entry is a real possibility if you engage in. He was talking to specific people, but it is a definite possibility where, okay, you're not there's full-blown enlightenment isn't there, but you're not going to fall back into a kind of those horrible cesspit kind of horrible states which none of us want to be in. Yes, could have.
Really concise, but while listening to you, I had this sense of or understanding of that there's this thing or experience or insight this guy had.
What guy?
Out of that,
the Buddha.
Yeah.
Yeah, that guy. Yeah.
And then out of that, certain things have been communicated.
Yeah.
And even Buddha is kind of might be just one thing
Yeah.
chosen just for didactical purposes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So all this TikTok thing, well, yeah, this might be talked about or not.
Yeah.
And then this whole one application of
Yeah.
just one thing of that
Yeah.
thing we cannot talk about.
Yes, very
So
good.
it's kind of, and we listen to it and take it like really, really seriously.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I have to do this to become happy. And,
Yeah.
and if skillful, what is skillful?
Yeah.
I don't know what I want to say, but I have this feeling that there's something that you cannot talk about.
Yeah. That's great. That's what I was saying.
So we need
You're right.
to talk about
Yeah.
something that seems relevant to us.
Yeah.
Like, how can I be happy?
Yeah. Well, it is relevant, isn't it?
But it's not enlightenment. Like enlightenment is like reality. Reality.
No. I mean, you could say all of the. There's a very, very good point. Yeah. In a way, the Buddha obviously only because you can only the Buddha could only communicate certain things in words that we could understand. Then he's picked certain things that's actually going to be helpful. Yeah. And like you said, the main thing is this whole business of what's called praticca samutpada or conditionality. This being that becomes the whole TikTok dance. Yeah. But that's like the central thing that he could communicate. Everything arises dependent on conditions. Yeah, but then this whole business of the conditions for suffering are basically being selfish, you could say, and the conditions for happiness is the opposite of that. That is just one application of that bigger experience, that truth, in response to other people, in response to people suffering. It's just that state of enlightenment looks at suffering, and the answer is there's conditions to your suffering. Yeah. So it's not like, and it's all skillful means, I think, at the end of the day, but it is true, it's true on different levels, isn't it? It's like, actually, yeah, this whole business of actions having consequences. That's what I mean. The Buddha's kind of, we'll have all sorts of responses to that. You know, maybe we feel a bit guilty, like, oh yeah, but I was born here and this was bad there and my family, and how can I respond well? And the Buddha's, it's not like the Buddha doesn't care, but he's talking in kind of big formulas. Not, you know, when he's talking to individual people, he was very empathic to an extraordinary extent and would talk to them with their individual needs and conditioning. But as a general formula that you can apply just generally, yeah, there's this whole business of conditionality. Things arise and cease on conditions. And then the general formula of if you actually want to be happy, then you behave skillfully. How we work that out in our own lives is a huge task. It's basically what it is to be a Buddhist in some respects. It's a real challenge, isn't it? But that's what we're left with, you know.
One reason why it seems relevant to me that this might be like enlightenment is something, and this whole happiness business is something, an outtake
Yeah.
of that is that the conditions for happiness seem to be skillful actions,
Yeah.
but the conditions for enlightenment
Yeah.
seem to be inside.
Yeah.
So
No, that's a very good point.
you know, it's
Yeah.
different conditions.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's more like the skillful action, you know, like, it's a bit of a, I don't know, but you've got this whole business of like what are called precepts, yeah, like ethical precepts. And in a way, I mean, it's a bit like Lala Taratna was looking at with a threefold path, yeah? You have the absolute bedrock is skillful action, yeah? And then you have meditation, so you can meditate well because you've got a clear conscience. And then on top of that, there's this business of wisdom, yeah? But they're not, in a certain sense, they're not different from each other. They are different, but they're actually the same thing. The more, you know, it's a bit like the metta bhavana, this cultivation of loving kindness, for example. You could take it as an insight practice. You look at how you can get a sense of how people are the way they are, yeah? And try and have some understanding. And that's also a sense of wisdom. There's conditions why I am like I am and you are like you are. So that's not very clear. But I think in a way it's a sliding scale, that's what I'm trying to say. I don't think there's like ethics only work here and then all of a sudden you go to another level. It's more like an expansion of the same thing. I will add something. Yeah, and also, that's what I was going to say. That word happiness is quite interesting, because I think it's one of the Buddha. Am I right? That it's one of the Buddha's epitaphs that he was the happy one. It was true. It was the Sugatas, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, so in a way we're quite lucky because somebody chose the word Buddhists rather than happies. We could be called the happies, yeah, because like the Buddha's state of enlightenment is happy, but not happy in the way, well, maybe connected the way when we feel happy. And I can only say from my own experience, if I've managed to kind of get into good state and like I'm actually genuinely caring about other people, I actually feel happy. Yeah. So I think in a way it's a sliding scale, you know. And in a way it's this whole business, the more selfless you become, well, if the main problem is we have this self, this kind of lumpy lump of whatever it is, and perceive the lump in the middle of us called a self, this kind of clump of stuff. If that's not there, then you're selfless, and therefore you have some sort of outward going experience, you know, reaching out to other people. We have time for one more. Yes.
I think it's kind of linked to that. It's a concise question, but very broad.
Yeah.
And what is, you mentioned in like skillful action is not being selfish.
Yeah.
What is being selfish?
Selfish. I don't know. It's a good question, isn't it? I mean, on an instinctual level, I think selfish is kind of just it's based on a delusion in a sense that my experience is as if the world revolves around me somehow. I mean, if that is the general experience, it's a bit difficult because it seems like everything's coming in here and going in here, and therefore I'm the centre of the universe. I mean, you probably are as well, but you know, my experience is, and therefore I want things my own way. In a way, generally want things to kind of go my own way, and I don't know. It's a sort of reactive state, isn't it? A kind of yeah, it's a kind of reactive state. You kind of want what you want at the expense or at the cost of other people or other people. And if you don't get what you want, then you get angry. And probably based on a kind of fundamental, well, it's said to be based on a fundamental misunderstanding of our whole situation. I know I'm selfish, I just don't quite know how to explain how selfish I am.
Because I think I'm reflecting on this thing of when do you need self-compassion?
Oh, yeah.
You need room for yourself.
Yeah.
And when less, and I guess this is the whole.
Well, I don't think. I think in a way, yeah, it's a good question. If you know, where does self-compassion come into being selfless? I think in Buddhism, you're not excluded from the picture. You know, like there's not a kind of martyr thing in Buddhism. I don't want to make any comparisons, but there's no kind of sense of it being beneficial to run yourself into the ground for other people, or to be a doormat. That's not really Buddhism. Yeah? You're one of the people that you're having, and eventually there's an equal love, but that doesn't mean equal and excluding you. It means there's an equal love. So the whole kind of that kind of self-compassion, it's one of those old things. You can't start in a way. It has to come from you. You have to be there has to be kind of an abundance internally. But it's funny because it can work the other way around as well, isn't it? The more, well, at least it has done for me, the more I put other people, I'm trying to do things for other people and trying to tame my own craving or nastiness. Actually, I start feeling I feel better about myself as well as an individual. I start to think, oh, I treat this person well actually, and I made an effort, and you know, and you start feeling like that kindness kind of comes back on you somehow as well, but just not in a martyrdom way, not in a kind of like destroying yourself for other people. Yeah. Good. Thank you. So end of class announcements. So